and friend. It's really fantastic to have him here because of the incredible work that he's been doing. And I understand that Clark is on his advisory board for an NSF grant that he's going to be speaking about. But let me tell you a little bit about him. Clark got his PhD from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas in Ed Psych, working with Gail Sinatra, whom many of you know. And he has many areas of professional interest which overlap with many of the interests that we have, especially in Ed Psych and the learning sciences. So it's a real treat to have you. So these areas can include cognitive judgments and reasoning, conceptual change, epistemic cognition, climate change education, and science education more broadly. He is an assistant professor. Sorry.
That's okay.
Wishful thinking for you. Assistant professor of middle grades education at Temple, as I said, and he's had a very productive year and a half. I count 9 papers in 2016 alone. So that's great, and I look forward to looking at these. So today he's going to be telling us about an NSF grant that he has been working on currently in its 4th year. And it's on students' plausibility, reappraisals, and knowledge about climate change, fracking, wetlands, and the Earth's moon. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Doug Lombardi.
Thanks, Janice.
You are welcome.
So I got to know Janice. We did a special issue a few years back, an educational psychologist, on student engagement in science learning. And I think a lot about Janice's article because it was about disengagement, and I've actually cited it a few times.
Oh, good.
It's just really a very clever way of thinking about it, how students disengage. So
thank you.
The way that this is an unconventional presentation, or non-traditional is the way I should say it. So what I would encourage you to do is ask for elaboration in the slides. So if there's something you want to know more about as I flip up these slides, how we measured something or how we did something, just ask. I'm not going to go through all the kind of like normal steps. And I think I like this way of presenting a little bit better. It makes it a little more dynamic and a little more interesting. So thanks a lot for coming. And actually, it's interesting. We're having a big kerfuffle at Temple right now because they have mislabeled our names on the websites, our titles. So I'm actually a assistant professor of science education, but I'm I kind of have split personality because I still do a lot of educational psychology. And the focus today will be a little bit science education-y and a little bit educational psychology. So I'll start out talking about just some quick theory and kind of the reform that may be driving this research to some degree. And I'll talk just briefly. I want to tell you about an experiment that I did involving undergraduates with some students in California, one at USC and one at Irvine, and involved undergraduate students. And I'll kind of set the stage for what I'll talk about then is kind of this more ecologically valid classroom studies, the messy kind of research that I like to do in classrooms, and I know that Clark likes to do, and probably many of you do. So it's a lot of fun, but it's vexing at times. So there's a really interesting paper, if you haven't read it, by Michael Ford. He's currently at NSF, and he is out of Pitt, and I don't know, he re-upped at NSF, so I don't know if he's going back to Pitt or what his deal is. But he thinks a lot about this idea about how scientists evaluate and how students should evaluate, and what it means in kind of this notion of science learning. And this kind of comes from the idea that there's scientific practices. There's these practices that scientists and engineers do. And I don't know if many of you have seen this figure. It's figure 3.1, page 45 of a framework for K-12 science education. And I really like this figure a lot. If you haven't read a framework for K-12 science education, I think it's a pretty robust, good document. Helen Quinn led the effort. She's a particle physicist. out of Berkeley. And one of the things that they thought about are what does scientists actually do? So these are not the scientific practices that they came up with. They came up with 8 scientific practices, but these are kind of just activities that scientists and engineers do. And they called it 3 spheres, even though they're more rectangular in shape. So it's kind of... And so these 3 spheres are investigating, evaluating, and then developing explanations and solutions. And the kind of work that I've been doing a lot of is in this area here about what students do in this middle sphere. Kind of this, and that's what I mean by evaluating. And so they characterize it as argue and critique and analyzing. And the interesting thing, which really relates to what we're talking about today, is so when we talk about evidence or these lines of evidence or evidences, it's really about kind of these observations and these experiments and these measurements that scientists do and kind of this collection of things. That's what I mean by a line of evidence. And kind of evaluating the connection between evidence and explanations as they construct these explanations about phenomenon. So this is kind of where we're going to roll today, and particularly at this nexus or this hub. And it's really kind of permeating now the NGSS, and I know that I'm not sure where control boards go. New Jersey is a NGSS state, Next Generation Science Standard state. I think it's been adopted by about 20 states. Kind of the momentum has slowed a bit. But it's emphasizing the role of evaluation and understanding scientific topics. You'll see this word crop up in these performance objectives throughout the NGSS. So both middle school and at high school levels. Not much in the performance objectives at the elementary level. And I really like this quote here. And it's in volume 2. And one of the things I've pondered a lot about and I've been thinking a lot about lately is kind of what is the nature of science. And there's, as you guys know, that there's this Norm Letterman formulation of the nature of science. And it's kind of dominated science education probably since the late 1990s. But there have been many people have kind of been pushing back on that. And there's some really good qualities about the way that Norm Letterman and his colleagues have characterized the nature of science, but there's also some problematic areas in the way that I think about it. And one of the problematic areas is this notion that scientific knowledge is tentative. And that's kind of the statement, scientific knowledge is tentative. And what that can lead to is kind of, I don't know if everyone watched The Big Bang Theory, but in The Big Bang Theory there's this idea, Zach, he's just kind of a common man, and he walks into this group of scientists and says, I love to talk about science because there's no right or wrong answers in science. So this tentative nature of science kind of, if you don't think about it, as many people don't, as heavily as I do, then you kind of think about that, any answer is right in science, it's impermanent and things like that, but it's not really the way that scientific explanations are constructed. They're constructed through these, in part through these evaluative processes. So I think that it's better to kind of think about what Alshin says from 2011 in kind of a response to Letterman, that scientists use evaluation, and Clark knows a lot about this, these evaluative criteria to construct and reconstruct evidence-based explanations. And I think that more accurately reflects the nature of science. The scientific knowledge is tentative. It is open to change, but only through a really kind of rigorous process. And part of that process involves evaluation. So that's kind of the reform foundation of it. But how does it play in theoretically? And I was here, I think I was here in 2012 or 2013, that school year. Clark was probably here at my talk then.
Probably figure it out, but I don't remember.
Yeah, so, and you were there, but so I showed the same slide. This is something I've been working on, and I should say thank you very much to Clark. He helped me kind of formulate this model. I've probably been thinking about it for a decade now, and what the way that evaluation is involved. This is an idea of plausibility, and which is one kind of judgment that people, scientists, or perception that scientists use when they think about explanations. Is it plausible, right? Is it a plausible explanation? For example, we just went through this job search at Temple, looking for an urban ed, a sociology of education. Are there any sociologists of education here? Do you guys have any sociologists of education in the GSC?
Actually, we don't.
But so I was kind of meeting these I was on the search committee. I was the kind of the outside person, and they talk a lot about plausibility in their construction of their explanations about education. I thought it was fascinating to me. So some scientists talk a lot about it, and some don't. And we talk about it in other venues besides science. For example, plausibility is talked about in like legal adjudication, for example. Is that a plausible explanation that the person had an alibi or something like that? So I think about plausibility a little bit, and it's a tentative judgment, though. It's judgment you're not committed to. It's probably judgment you don't think about. When you don't think about it very much, it's kind of that automatic processing that goes on in your brain. It's more of a perception than I would say a judgment. But if you do think about it explicitly, maybe like these sociologists of education, then it becomes more of a judgment, more of a deliberate process, purposeful process. And the kind of work that I'm doing now is trying to get students to do that through this process of evaluation. And I don't understand exactly how it all works yet, but I'm trying to think about it some more. So there's these different levels of evaluation. Some are more critical, some are less critical, and it kind of forms into this idea of how the plausibility judgment forms. And you can kind of reconsider that, and you may be able to reconsider that explicitly. Now, this is a conceptual change model. I'm not going to talk a lot about conceptual change, but I think it might be applicable to other general learning situations. At least our data show that there's a relation between knowledge and plausibility. Most often, although I'll show you a curious finding towards the end.
So can I ask a question about this?
Of course.
Is your, since you said
you just asked a question, so ask another one.
Another question. So do you mean that it's sort of like a branching structure where someone says, okay, it's not plausible, stop all processing. It is plausible, I'll continue kind of making an epistemic commitment to the idea and evaluate data? Is that sort of what you mean?
Yeah, that's kind of what I mean.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it.
Okay.
So now let's talk about how I've kind of been applying kind of this notion of evaluation in science learning and evaluation in plausibility judgments and how it relates to knowledge and knowledge change, knowledge acquisition with a quick experiment. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the slide, but I do want to talk about it a little bit. And we ran this experiment with undergraduate students in California, and we did it online, and we involved these things called refutation texts. And refutation texts that are reading people love it, and educational psychology people love it. Science education people don't like it as much because they have some trouble, I think, translating into the classroom. So there's this notion of maybe they're not as ecologically valid, but they're kind of nice for testing things. Although they don't always work very well. They have to be. They're very hard to construct. Refutation texts. And as a matter of fact, this is just a piece of it. And I don't expect you to read that. I purposely graded it so it was all fuzzy. But there's some pieces here. And what the idea in the refutation text, and it comes from Paul Vandenberg and Penny Kindu, is that what you try to do in a refutation text to get it to work well is you try to activate two conceptions together in your brain at the same time, in your thinking. And they call that co-activation. it could be your prior knowledge, or it could be another conception. And I've called it prior knowledge here. And then you put the scientifically accurate conception. And the way you do that in the refutation text is you put in like one sentence after the other. So, for example, this first sentence in this paragraph here said, some people believe that the greenhouse effect is something dangerous created through human activity. And then and then the next sentence says, however, it's incorrect. You refute that immediately. It's incorrect to think that the greenhouse effect is something dangerous caused by humans. It's kind of this notion of, the misconception here would be that the greenhouse effect is this dangerous thing, and as opposed to it being a natural process on Earth that warms up the planet. Although there's an enhanced greenhouse effect that's causing some problems right now. So humans are enhancing it a bit. So the idea here is to co-activate these two kind of conceptions in the brain simultaneously. And that's the way that these refutations text works. And like I said, this text has gone, it's kind of like the Bible. It's just people keep rewriting it, reworking it, and redoing it. And people have used it in Illinois and Michigan and California and Temple and all over. We've been using this text. And so what we saw, let me just walk you through this, is that we had some pretty significant shifts, and they read the text. The whole experiment took them about 40 minutes. We measured a lot of stuff pre. They read the text, and we measured a lot of stuff post. And voila, I didn't expect these kind of shifts just from something happening so quickly. Just a quick reading, but we got these big shifts. So what did we shift? Well, one of the things we shifted was they shifted towards the scientific model, their plausibility perception maybe at this point, because we weren't really activating judgments or getting them to think explicitly about it. And they shifted towards the scientific conception. The way this works is it's easy to measure, well, it's relatively easy to measure. We measure plausibility in different ways, but most of the time we measure it, or often we measure it as we're thinking about the plausibility of an explanation. So we put an explanation or a model in there, an explanatory model, and we just ask people to rate the plausibility of that on a scale of 1 to 10. And then we give them an alternative, a compelling, plausible alternative, maybe plausible alternative. And in this case, it was the human-induced climate change model versus the sun-induced climate change model. The idea that there's a popular skeptics model, it's still popular, regrettably, that the sun is putting out more energy, and that's what's causing our current climate change. And the reason we do it on a scale of 1 to 10 is because I've always fascinated, because there's some discussions that plausibility is kind of this probabilistic reasoning mode, but it's not. The data continually show that it's not, because if you have two alternatives on a scale of 1 to 10 and you rate one a 9, the other one should be a 1. Right? That's probabilistic reasoning. That's thinking in terms of probability. But people, I just saw it the other day. I did this with my students in my science methods class. And this one student, she's so upset. She's so upset about climate change. She weeps. She doesn't even like me to bring up the topic. She'll weep about it. Humans are killing the planet. They're so upset. She rated the human-induced model at 10 right at the beginning of this little activity we did. And she rated the sun-induced model at 5. We did the whole activity, and at the end of it, she was engaging it. She did a great job on the activity. But at the end of it, she rated it 10 and 5. And I said, you don't think that sun-induced model is probably a little less plausible? And she said, no, it could still be a reason. So it's just fascinating. Just fascinating to me. But anyway, so this is how we do it. And the way this number is it's just the rating minus the scientific model minus the skeptics model or the alternative model. And so a 0 means that they're equally plausible, and plus values mean it's more towards the scientific. So you can see about a category and a half shift there. Decent effect size there. And their knowledge also changed quite a bit. Now, how much change in knowledge is that? It's about a 5% change in knowledge in just about 40 minutes. Not bad. Interesting.
Can you tell us what was in the text apart from the refutation?
This text has a metaphor to help build the understanding of how the greenhouse effect might work. And then the metaphor is the car, your car parked in the sun.
So does it have evidence per se?
Not a lot of evidence. And remember, the way I focus, of course you remember this, is that the way I think about plausibility is it focuses on the explanations. And what I've been thinking about lately is that we don't really, I'm not seeing a lot of discussion anywhere. I've been looking about plausibility of evidence. I think other judgments come into play there, like reliability, trustworthiness, things like that. So, just a quick experiment. It was really interesting, but we also measured, here's the more interesting part. You've seen this. We also measured evaluations that the students made. And there was a weird experiment done in the late 2000s by Glasner and Schwartz. And what it was, there was these pro and con arguments. One was pro for death penalty, one was con death penalty. And the way that they measure the evaluativeness of students is they have to find as many flaws in pro and con argument that they can. They have to write them down. And it has to be a reasonable flaw. So we just had them do that. We just replicated that piece to kind of ascertain what students' evaluation level is. And the more evaluative, the more flaws that they found that were reasonable for the pro and con arguments, what that related to. For the reputation text only, this blue is evaluation here. So for the refutation text only, there's some idea here that maybe this refutation, when they were looking at these conceptions right next to each other, alternative conceptions, it was activating their evaluation, their evaluative thinking.
That's self-report?
The flaws, the evaluation is we analyze their flaws. So they wrote down flaws, and then we looked to see if they're reasonable, and we looked to see how many that they could find.
And that's what that evaluation?
That's what that evaluation is.
I see.
Plausibility was also a big factor with the refutation text. But look at this, prior knowledge didn't play in as much in their. Look at how big prior knowledge is with we ran half of them with an expository text, which is basically the refutation text without the refutation. Look at that, prior knowledge big here, small here. Still significant, but big here. Evaluation not significant. Plausibility not as significant. It's just a fascinating result. And that's why I wanted to pull it up. And kind of the way that I'm interpreting this is Penny Kindu's been doing some more recent work on refutation, and she's thinking that it's not just co-activation of the conceptions of importance, but there has to be some kind of what she calls competing activation, where the scientific conception or the conception to be learned, that the teacher wants the student to be learned, has to compete with the wrong conception or the incorrect conception or the background knowledge or whatever, and it has to beat it. And so we may have some evidence here for competing activation. Yes.
I'm trying to understand that. It seems to make sense given your other argument about that people don't have this probabilistic version of probability or model of probability. So you just kind of said it quickly, but this one example where she says it could also be this other thing, or that could also have a factor. Thinking that these are like independent factors explaining the result rather than like exclusive, like one or the other. I'm just trying to understand that. Does that help?
Yeah, I'm thinking that may be the way, because I talked to her a little bit more about it, and that's where she kind of followed up with, well, but some of it still may be the sun. And I'm going, well, it actually turns out, and I'll show you a picture here that right in the back, the nice pictures that I showed at the beginning and that I show in a little bit, Wright did. He created these pictures for our project. So I wanted to shout him out. Thank you. But what it actually turns out is the sun is actually, for a large measure where the temperature spiked up, the sun was actually decreasing in its energy output, and it's just can't explain this major change that we've had. And the evidence kind of points to that pretty clearly, the lines of evidence.
Right. So you can take each explanation and you can decide whether it's more or less plausible. But what you're saying, it's not enough just to look at them separately. You have to look at them as competing. That, like, if this one is more probable, then this one is less probable.
Yeah. And you have to think about them at the same time, is what I'm saying. And what we find, and I want to get to the good stuff. This is good. I want to get to the better stuff. Is we've really analyzed the student explanations, and we see them being most evaluative when they consider both of the models together. They're considering how a line of evidence supports or doesn't support a particular explanation or model. But when they think about them both at the same time, that's when we see the really most evaluative qualities that they have. And you guys may be finding similar things in the work that you're doing.
Can I ask one question about that? Sorry, I know you want to go on, but so are you and is Penny considering that, assuming that there's like a mental model construction a la Van Dyke and Kinch going on, and then the student is evaluating each line, as they're building a situation model?
Yeah, I possibly. I don't know if she's thinking about it like line by line, but I think it's along that line.
All right.
So let's get to the better stuff. So one of my concerns, and maybe a concern of many people in the room, is refutation texts work and they don't work, and they're hard to construct. They're just not really, I don't know how useful they are for the classroom. So it's kind of a pragmatic argument that I'm making right now, is pragmatically, can teachers use refutation text in the classroom? In a high school earth science classroom, and I'm not so certain that they can. So what I've been thinking about is what can we do to help teachers and help their students kind of in response to the NGSS or the framework for educational science. We want students to engage in scientific practice in the classroom. We want them to evaluate in the way a scientist would. When they think about the connections between evidence and explanations, how do you do that? So I was lucky to get a 3-year NSF project. It's a great team. Clark's on the advisory board. I have a lot of great researchers and teachers that are involved in the project, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. And it's essentially been a 3-year design-based study, but it's actually in its 4th year now. I'm in the no-cost extension year, so we had a little money left over, and thank goodness, because there's just a lot of data, and so I've been spending a lot of time with the data. It's been a lot of fun. So essentially the way, and you probably know this, the way design-based research works is we've developed the instruction materials with the strong help of the teachers. They're part of the project. They're working hand in hand with the research team. We go out and we pilot test in their classrooms, and then we adjust and revise and fix. And we talk to the advisory panel, and they tell us to adjust and revise or fix. And we kind of iterate. We've iterated through that for a couple of years. And then in the 3rd year, I have some data at the very end, which we're still analyzing. We're looking at a kind of a quasi-experimental design where they use some of the materials, but then they use other materials that are different, comparison materials. And the overall driving question is just how does the sustained instruction of if they do this kind of instruction at various points throughout the year, does that result in plausibility reappraisal and knowledge changes? And we looked at earth science topics. And so Clark and Ravi and Ron, who's in Iowa, and I don't know where Luke is now, but he's in South Africa, and others. Who did I miss? Who else developed this mode and structure for the model evidence link diagram?
Will Pluto. He's an assistant dean in medical school at University of California, Irvine.
And Rick Duschel, did he help you guys think about?
Yes.
Rick Duschel was involved with the team. I was uncertain. I didn't know about Pluto and Duschel. but so I thought that. So this is, I don't expect you to read all this either, but this is kind of how, when you looked at that first, so Clark and company, Dr. Mervite and company thought of this wonderful way to do things, and you guys were using, are you still, your project's still going on? And it's with middle grades classrooms and life science classrooms. And I was working on my dissertation, and my advisor said, you got to use this. And so I created one for climate change. And so it's these two models that we talked about. Current climate change is caused by increasing amounts of energy from the sun. Current down here in B, and then current climate change is caused by human activities. Did 4 lines of evidence. And the way it works when students do this activity is they connect arrow between the evidence and the explanatory model. And the kind of arrow they draw, do you guys know all this? You guys know all this because this is Clark stuff. Probably I don't know if you guys talk about that. You guys do other things. This is just, but the arrow tells that either strongly supports, contradicts, or has nothing to do with the model. And then the second page is the explanation task, and students write an explanation. So they pick 3 of the arrows and they discuss them in more detail. And this is fun. And this is what we evaluate for evaluation. And then they do the plausibility. We have them do it before. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a second. But they rate the plausibility. That's how they would do it. So in this particular case, this actual student work. Model A, climate change was very plausible, and sun-induced model wasn't, so that would be a +7. That's how you score it. Simple. And I think it's especially effective with topics of large plausibility gaps. I'll explain why in a second. So, and what I mean by a plausibility gap is a gap between what normal people, students, find plausible and what scientists find plausible in a scientific context. So here's Wright's pictures, some more Wright's pictures. Wright did all of our. So we used the causes of current climate change model evidence link diagram. Teachers and the research team and I developed one for hydraulic fracturing and earthquakes, kind of the link between fracking and earthquake activities. These two are probably these are more controversial topics, so there's controversy associated with those topics. And then we also created one for formation of the Earth's moon. This one's really kind of fascinating because if you walk on the street and ask people where did the moon come from, many of them will say it came from a captured asteroid or something like that. So, and the scientific model is just this weird kind of impact theory thing. So there's a plausibility gap there. And then there's one that we developed around wetlands and land use. And this one's a little bit different. It's not really that the explanatory models are scientific. They're more of value type judgments about what you want your community to be like. Although the lines of evidence are scientific, the models aren't necessarily what I would consider a scientific model. Why did we pick those 4? It's a rhetorical question, but the point is that if you think about a nominal or not, it's not nominal, many earth science classrooms, if you have earth science for a full year, they'll cover topics in kind of geology and geophysics. They'll talk about water resources. They'll talk about climate and weather. And then usually in the 4th quarter, they talk about astronomy. That's a typical earth science year-long progression into high school. And that's not really, I mean, it's typical. I don't know what the percentage is, but it's common that way. So, climate and weather, geology, astronomy, and water resources. And 3 districts have been in our study. So 2 from New Jersey, one about here, small district, suburban, very posh, one of the top 50 districts in the country. One about here, just kind of a more standard garden variety suburban district, much larger. And then we involved a very large urban district, about twice the size of the Philadelphia school district. In not as big as the New York City district, but it's big, and with a majority Hispanic population, about 40% Hispanic. And the schools we worked in, one of the schools we worked in is about 70% Hispanic. You'll see it up here in a second. And the idea there is that what we're trying to do is look at generalizability. Plus the fact that I had 2 really good master teachers, one in this district and one up here in earth science, that really know their stuff. So one of them is a former GSC graduate, got her PhD a year ago, 2 years ago. So, and 8 total teachers were involved in the project, 4 from the New Jersey districts and 4 from the Nevada district. And half of them were involved in years 1 and 2. Actually, half of them were involved in years 1, 2, and 3, but they were our pilot testers and our developers. And the other half came in on year 3, and they were our fresh, untainted people that we use for the quasi-experimental design. We use their students in their classrooms and things like that. So in years 2 and 3, year 1, we were developing the materials and we did some pilot testing in the classrooms, but we didn't really do it much, very sequentially. But in years 2 and 3, this was a quasi-experimental design. This was the major pilot test. They did the 4 model evidence link diagrams spaced throughout the year, pretty much first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter. They didn't all do them in the same order, though. Part of the deal with kind of when you do design-based research is you can't really tamper too much with the normal classroom setting because you miss. Particularly in the Nevada district, they have curriculum pacing guidelines that they have to follow. They have to be at certain spots at certain times because there'll be a test soon because they test the students right and left. It's accountability. So you've got to follow the curriculum pacing guidelines. Many of them did the fracking model evidence link diagram, first one, but not all. And the moon was generally the last one, but not all. And the way it works is they do a quick knowledge pretest. For the first few that they do, we want them to get them to think about plausibility a little more, and there's this plausibility ranking test that I can talk about if you want to, but it's a task just to get them to think about what plausibility might be. They look at the models and discuss the models, and they do this plausibility pre-ranking, and then they do the MEL activity, which is the diagram, the explanation task, and it has plausibility post, and then we do a knowledge post test. One of the things that came out early in our first year pilot test and right at the beginning of year 2 was that we had to decrease our length of our knowledge instruments because it was impacting the classroom too much. It was confusing the teachers, it was confusing the students because they thought, this is a test. I should be getting a grade for this. I want to know how I did. And the teachers were going, how do we assess this? What do we do with this? So one of the decisions I made early on was to cut it from the knowledge test that I showed you with the experimental design is about 27 items. It's an instrument that I've been using for several years now, and very reliable, good instrument. And we developed 3 more for fracking, wetlands, and the moon that were roughly about 30 items each. And we each change those radically into just a little pop quiz now. It's just a little 5-item measure. And they're hanging in there. They're hanging in there with the reliability. They're hanging in. I'm kind of pleased with them. The way that we designed, we picked items from the longer measures, and we Made sure we had one item that related to each line of evidence, because each MEL has 4 lines of evidence, and then one that was just a kind of another strong kind of fundamental concept. They're not directly mapped onto the lines of evidence. They're fundamental science principles like you would see on a standardized test, for example. So these are just, they're not really tests, they're more quizzes, public quizzes. That made our teachers much happier. So, what do we get for year 2? It's a pretty busy graph. So this is plausibility. And the way it works is, so Southwest, I wrote, this has been accepted with major revisions. I hope it gets accepted with full Monty in Science Education, Journal Science Ed. And we were concerned about anonymity, so these are the Nevada districts. This one here is the orange one is the really large majority Hispanic population. This MA stands for Middle Atlantic. That's our New Jersey districts. These are Nevada schools, and they're this gray one is the posh school district of the Chathams. So as I normally see, we had about a category and a half shift in plausibility, which I've seen almost every time with the climate change MEL. Every time I've used it, almost everywhere. Category and a half shift. And generally people think the students think they're equally plausible at the beginning and really slide towards the scientific conception. School district of the Chatham people were really convinced. Fracking, we also saw a little bit bigger shift, more in the category and a half. So, but they were thinking that the model that there's no way that these fracking activities can cause these kind of earthquakes. We frame it in terms of earthquake swarms, which soon we're going to be out of my content knowledge, but it's not just that it's like it's like a bee swarm, but there's these earthquake swarms that occur in Oklahoma and occur in Ohio. And they're moderate earthquakes that a whole bunch of them come together and they stop. So, and what's really been interesting as we've been involved with this project over the last 3.5 years is that there's lots more scientific evidence coming out. This is rapidly evolving. When we started out, it was a little bit more uncertain from the scientific side, but there's a major issue of science that came out. And it turns out that wastewater injection associated with just any kind of general drilling activities are probably causing these moderate sized earthquakes, these swarms. But people say, okay, well, it's not fracking doing it. It's wastewater injection associated with just any drilling activities. But if you know anything about fracking, you know that it's just like increased the number of drilling activities exponentially over the past decade and a half. So it may not be like direct, but it's pretty direct.
So smoking's not related to cancer, kind of direct, right?
Yeah. So anyway, so there's a big shift here, big shift here. Didn't get any shift for wetlands. No plausibility shift. Didn't get any shift for the moon. These are our controversial topics. These are our non-controversial topics. Now, individual schools may have shifted a little bit, but I'm looking at now the gross results here a little bit. I'll send you the whole paper if you want to read all the excruciating detail. So we actually have like this jump down here. It's not significant, but these are pretty much flat line.
So did you
and they go, you got to go to this workshop tomorrow because they said they're not going to publish any papers with ANOVA designs or MANOVA designs anymore. They're going to reject them automatically. So I went and learned about mixed effects modeling, and I'm using it now. It's good. It's actually advantageous for us because more variance can be explained. And it's particularly effective for us because sometimes, like, I'll show you the explanations here in a little bit. The explanations, students students may just do 2 explanations or 3 explanations or things like that. It's not sensitive to, you don't have to reduce the data. You can use all the data. It's really very clever. I'm not here to talk about mixed physics more, but I'm so excited about it. Anyway, so we saw some plausibility shifts not, but we did see knowledge gains for everyone. So just the act of doing this fun activity, we saw knowledge gains across the board. Now, how much knowledge gains we had? About roughly 5% for each one. So it's a 90-minute activity. It takes about 2 class periods or a long class period. And so if every activity did that, I think that would be good. So I'm not saying that the model evidence link diagram is the only thing that you would do in your classroom. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is maybe you do it at the beginning of your unit. 2-week unit on water resources or wetlands, whatever you're going to do. 2-week unit on the moon that you're going to do in your high school classroom. Just one of the activities that you would do. Hopefully your other ones will be equally as effective. And by the end of it, you should be pretty strong. That's the hope. So we're not here to fix the world, but we're here to do our best. So these are all significant jumps. And effect size, like I said, it's about 5 to 6%, but we have an omnibus, pretty large effect. Now here's the interesting thing. So we scored, I had a paper come out also in 2016 where we spent it was a big qualitative analysis. We spent a lot of time reading the explanations from our students. And we developed a way to think about these different levels of evaluation that students have based on what they write. And so we score based on that. And so, and regrettably, the arrows here, people kind of get confused here. Remember I told you that this kind of relates back to my theoretical model, where it's kind of this process of evaluation and plausibility reappraisal. And what we see here is that evaluation mediates the plausibility judgment at that point because they're explicitly considering plausibility and the knowledge. This is the first time ever that I haven't seen a direct path. Normally I see a direct path there, but I didn't even see it in this one. It's not significant. Background knowledge was still a big player though for these students. This is the very broad 30,000 foot view at this point. These are more the fine-grained views. This is more of the 30,000 foot view. So that's good news too. Not quite as clear-cut as the experiment, but it's in a classroom. Oh, so these are hot off the presses. Here's our mixed effects modeling results. These are just descriptives. So, we've got some problems with the data, but basically we're seeing the same trend so far. These are just model evidence link diagrams. For the comparison activities, we did what we call the monomel, which is just, it's the diagram with just one alternative. It's just really bizarre. And then we used what we call the MET, but it's the model evidence link table that you guys have developed. And don't trust anything I'm saying right now, but the MELT and the MEL diagram look pretty close, and the monomel is lower. So performance is not as good. So that's good. We call it the MET. We were calling it the MELT, and you guys still call it the MEL. But anyway, it's kind of confusing. So these are just 2 classrooms, by the way, pre-post. So also, as kind of not a side project, it's kind of a parallel project, we worked on some practitioner pieces talking about each of the model evidence link diagrams and the assessment, how you might assess this in the classroom. And so the whole research team was involved with it. Master teachers, they were lead authors on some. I had an undergraduate RA that was lead author on the evaluation piece. I have graduate RAs, faculty researchers. So it's free. It's a special issue. It's an open access issue. You can download it if you want. Read it, the whole issue. This was the last summer issue. And what I'm thinking about now is this is a metaphor. You know, scaffolding. I tell you the funniest thing about education, when I was in educational psychology or just education, is I didn't know. It took me like 2 years before I figured out scaffolding was a metaphor for construction, knowledge construction. So I always say that it's a metaphor just in case there's anybody out there like me. But so the question is, particularly since the horror of November, is what happens when you take away the instructional scaffold? Can you get students to activate their scientific thinking when they're confronted with scientific topics? So that's really what I've been thinking about. So we put in a new proposal for an NSF grant. Who knows if we'll get it? Probably not, because they're very competitive. But we're trying to figure out ways that we can remove the scaffolding and see if they develop a little more robust mental model of scientific thinking. Activate that when it's time to be thinking scientifically. And then when you're watching Legends of Tomorrow, you can deactivate it. So that's kind of where I'm going and thinking about that. And hopefully we'll be able to deal with future challenges, like how to elect somebody that's qualified for the job. So you guys can ask a lot of questions. You can ask me, or you can visit the project website, or send me emails. I can show you some stuff. We got 3 minutes left. That clock is accurate. What questions do you have?
Does anyone want to start? If not, I'll start. So this is really interesting. Thanks so much. Really fascinating work. So I have a question about the model evidence link diagram. And so I'll put on my pure cognitive science hat, right? So those representations about how plausible you think the evidence is, I think are really good ways to offload working memory, right? And then if a student is making an evaluation, sort of overall, you could see how that, they can kind of do a mental tally of, well, I believed that, I didn't believe that, I wasn't so sure about this, I absolutely didn't believe that. And then they have kind of a concrete way to evaluate, you know, ballpark whether they quote unquote believe it or not, right? So how much do you think that is driving the effects that you're seeing, versus, or, you know, in general, versus them developing competency? So this gets at your scaffolding question, right? And it could be that over multiple iterations of teaching them how to kind of really, you know, basically, you know, put a number down. How much do you believe it or not that they are coming to a habit of mind of evaluating evidence, right?
Yeah, so that's my worry. So I've been thinking a lot about that. And what we're finding, I said I had a lot of data, what we're finding is that it's probably becoming more automated and only with the scaffold. So they're not developing a robust representation to do this.
Right.
I don't think, when they do 4. And I forgot who came up with it. Maybe been Clark or Kim Caston. She's on our advisory board. And people were telling me, you got to do this, you got to do this, you got to do this. And I kept saying no. And then finally it hit me. I don't know when it hit me or how it hit me, but have the students construct the model evidence link diagram. Have them do it from like available lines of evidence and available explanatory models. So that's what we're proposing now. We call it the Build-A-Mel, like a Build-A-Bear.
Yeah, Phil Bell did some stuff like that, you know, on the Deformed Frogs project. It's similar. It's not exactly that, but it's similar, which is very useful, I think.
Yeah, so I think that's how, and then if NSF doesn't fund it, then we'll try to do it anyway. But yeah, so that's what I've been worried about, is how automatic does it become. What I do know, too, or anecdotally I know, because I've done this a lot with students, a lot with teachers, and it's cognitive. They're tired at the end of it. They're tired. They're thinking a lot. So
yeah, it's a huge cognitive load.
Yeah, it is.
That you're asking them to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But here's the interesting thing. I didn't point this out. Is with rare exception, I'm sure these people ping out on their cognitive load working memory tests, these students at School District of the Chathams, because all of them go to Princeton or Yale.
Right.
Harvard. And all of these, excuse me, that's this one. All of these students go to the Riviera Hotel, and they work there.
Right.
And there's not, in large measures, there's not a large difference between maybe where they start, but what's interesting when you look at that is that they end up kind of at the same place. So that's good news. We're looking more at demographics because we have more careful demographics with the quasi-experimental design, and we'll let you know if that holds up.
Other questions? I have other questions, but I could, take every minute.
Talk about them at lunch. Who are the graduate students in here?
Rachel's done some stuff on refutation text and eye tracking, which I have some
Okay.
ideas about.
So I'll make a comment. I think that reputational text can be used in the classroom, but here's the puzzle that I have about reputation text. There's a body of research on reputation text that you just jump in and give these students a one-page text and conceptual change.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, we've got people like David and me and Carol Smith and others design, 6-month units and can only get some conceptual change. So there's something very odd about this juxtaposition of findings, and frankly, I believe the classroom research more, that there's something artificial about the results we're getting with reputation text studies. And I've done it. I have data from a study too. I get the same results, but there's something I think superficial about it. It's not I suspect that if we applied a real panoply of deep measures, we'd find that the learning wasn't very deep in some cases.
Or measures over longer time periods, right? If it's robust, you should see.
Yeah.
But I suspect you're probably right. But I think there's something else going on. Like when you're kind of evaluating a text, it may be part of a bigger conceptual change process, but it could be just the very start of it. And those measures are like, they're like you say, probably superficial, and there's a very tentative nature to them. And
Yeah, I think I'm abandoning them for the same reasons, Clark. I don't believe the results. It just doesn't seem, maybe they could be used in the classroom. So we actually did a study with the same text in Oklahoma, and it looks like it had a deleterious effect.
On which topic?
Same, climate change. So, and that one, so I was not the PI on that project, and I won't be the lead author if we ever get any reasonable data, but they measured so much stuff, more than just these simple measures that I do. They measured so much. I think that people were just really angry about doing this, sitting there for an hour and doing this experiment. So I don't necessarily trust those results either. But I'm going to go to APA. The first time ever going to APA, we're going to publish those results there. So I know. So I've never been to APA before. So
are there other questions? I have another question about your fracking. So
do you want to see it?
I can see it, but I think I can remember.
Oh, I can. I don't have it up there. I don't know if I have internet, so
that's
maybe
all right.
I can't show you.
So, do you think that the results for the fracking that's where you see the biggest effect because people have the least amount of prior knowledge for fracking?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. Yeah, that's what our teachers were telling us too. So we actually had to develop a little bit of extra text material for the fracking mill. We call it introduction, and Wright's gone, but he wrote some more figures for us, and we wrote some more text, and just kind of an information sheet for the students just to tell them what fracking is.
There's also a vocabulary issue there.
Yes.
In the sense that it's very, very clear that people who are against the process call it fracking, and people who are in favor of the process call it hydraulic fracturing.
Right, and we treat it with much more.
It doesn't sound different to you, all right?
Hydraulic fracturing. We treat it with much more dignity than. So we call it hydraulic fracturing, and we call it fracking. We refer to how different people refer to it, things like that.
So the topics are fracking, climate change,
Wetlands and land use, and formation of the earth's moon.
Do you think there's a temporal quality? A lot of geoscience, right? What's hard about hard of it is that the time scale is so hard for them to understand. Do you think there's an element of that?
So in my very first ever study in educational research, I looked at students' understanding of deep time, and there's a relation there to these constructs that I've talked about. So maybe.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the climate change thing is so politically charged now that if someone self-identifies as a, Republican, they by virtue of that, they have to deny climate change, to be a card-carrying Republican.
Yeah, and I haven't talked about like belief change or any of that stuff, so that's a different ball of wax.
So I have another. Does anyone have any questions? Because I could keep them going all day, right? Do you?
Well, you also have lunch with you.
Yeah, I know. So that's why I don't want to. I don't want to keep jumping in. But if nobody else has another question. So I once wrote a proposal on kind of epistemic commitment. That's very highfalutin for me because I like very technical things, but it didn't get funded, to be fair. But I'm curious about this notion of epistemic commitment from the point of view of conceptual change and model building, mental model building. And you could almost imagine like a continuum of very surface level text processing, almost like the analog of, that's school science versus real science. And then, surface level text comprehension, deep model building, and then conceptual change on a continuum. Okay.
So I talk about that. So plausibility is not a commitment, characteristically, as I would define it. But if you do have commitment, then you're okay. But even if you think the plausibility of the explanation, the scientific explanation, is more plausible than the alternative explanation, but you're committed to the other one,
yeah,
you ain't gonna change.
Yeah, and that's consistent with Gail's work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it very much builds on our work.
Right, not surprisingly. Great. Well, if there's no other questions, no other questions? This has been really fascinating.
Thanks,
thank you so
you
much.
guys.
Please
Thank you
join
for
me and thank
coming.
you, Dr. Lombardi. Really cool.
Nice day.